Welcome to the Institute for Government. I'm Julian McRae, I'm Deputy Director at the Institute. And today we have a fascinating event which is looking at open data and transparency. Looking a little bit at a sort of time travel, I hope we're going to take you on today. A little bit about the future, because that's always interesting, but actually we're all very interested in the past. I think it's generally recognised the UK has made huge progress around these issues over the last few years. Actually, got a reasonably long timescale this has been bringing up inside government. And we want to take a look at, well, what were the ingredients that have helped the UK move forward to the extent that we're now one of the world leaders, and people look coming from overseas. We get quite a lot here at the Institute, I'm sure other people in this room do as well, of people coming to the UK to see what we're doing now, where are we going, how have we taken on that leading role. So we wanted to gather together some people who've been involved across quite a span of time in this area, and just get some reflections on what's happened, what's been going on, what's made this work, and indeed what have been the frustrations and what have been the things that are the barriers that we need to think about before taking the agenda forward. So as I said, I'm delighted to welcome our panel today. We have Frances Maude. We'll need probably very little introduction, Minister for the Cabinet Office, but has been championing this agenda inside government for the last nearly 5 years now. So Nigel Shadbolt, who again has been fundamentally part of this agenda for a huge period of time, dating back into the last administration and beyond. We have Jeni Tennison, who works at the Open Data Institute, but again has been part of the change that has been going on at the very heart of very many things, legislation.uk and other examples inside government as well as outside. And finally, Tom Loosemore, again, a long period of time, a champion. I was rereading before this some of your evidence to select committees going back in the 2000s. But now inside government, and very much on the inside at the Government Digital Service. So we wanted to run through those and gather the reflections from our panel today. We'll then probably take a few sort of contributions from the floor. I know there are a lot of people here who are very interested and very involved in this agenda. And then general questions, comments, Q&A. I'm sure people will be interested both about the past, but also I suspect some issues about the future and where this agenda is going. Just the general house sort of things. You will see up there access to our network if you want to log into that. We'll be tweeting this event ourselves. Please do tweet. I think the hashtag is hashtag open data. Brilliant. And without any further ado, let me hand over to Frances, who will talk initially for 10-15 minutes on what your perspectives on this, what's happening with transparency and where we might be going.
Brilliant.
It's Frances.
Well, thank you very much, Julian. It's not often one gets invited along to an event and actually you're encouraged to brag about what you've done and about how brilliant you've been. But actually, I mean, I think we are acknowledged to be world leader in open data. And this isn't easy territory, actually. The first point to make is politicians always talk about transparency when they're in opposition. It seems like a really great idea when you're in opposition. And then there's a tendency for their first 12 months in government to be equally enthusiastic about it because all you're doing is exposing what your predecessors have done. And then you get to the moment when you are in real time exposing for scrutiny and accountability what you yourselves are doing, and it gets tough then, and we're stuck at it. And we are the leader, but others are moving quickly in this territory as well. This is a real international movement. You know, my well-known now mantra is, which gets trotted out by other enthusiasts for open data around the world and transparency, is nothing is so powerful as an idea whose time has come, and transparency is an idea whose time has come. And all of us who get it and are enthusiastic about it need to make sure it becomes irreversible. It puts people in government out of their comfort zone, whether you're a politician or a civil servant and official. It's uncomfortable. And the default setting is the reverse. So changing the way we think about this and how we do it is difficult to do. And actually, We couldn't have done it without some brilliant civil servants who completely have got it. Certainly my team in the Cabinet Office, but much more widely around government, where what we've done over these years is find the enthusiasts, find the people who get it and who are willing to be difficult about it and you know, wear down the opposition. The other thing we did absolutely at the outset, and this was very much the advice I think that Nigel Shadbolt and others gave to me, which is set up a transparency board, bring into government people who really know what they're talking about, because you know, if you're a jobbing politician, when you are presented with the range of reasons why things can't be done, into which goes enormous amounts of creativity, you need people with real expertise who can say, no, that's not a reason for not doing it, who break down and help you to overcome the objections to doing things. And there is a very wide range and extensive range of reasons, which increases all the time. And we really meant it when we said we wanted to be the most transparent government ever when the coalition government was formed. We needed it as our friend, actually, because we faced this huge budget deficit. It was the biggest budget deficit, I don't want to boast, but it was the biggest budget deficit in the developed world. And we were coming out of the deepest recession. And we needed to cut spending, and transparency is your friend when you start to do difficult things with departmental budgets. But at the same time as the need for us to do things differently, the possibilities had changed because of technology, the internet and mobile technology. The private sector got this in a way, or large parts of it, got it well ahead of governments. Now consumers instinctively check customer reviews before they book a hotel, or they check a price comparison website before buying insurance, and people should expect when they deal with public services to have the same level of visibility and the ability to make choices. Because actually the public are paying for them whether they like it or not, and we need to have a transformative approach here. So it makes us more accountable, it strengthens our democracy, it informs choice over public services, and that's hugely important, but also hugely importantly, transparency and open data feeds economic and social growth. You build both commercial success and jobs and wealth in the private sector from the use of open data as a raw material, but also social entrepreneurs and communities have been building social capital using the power of data. So, I mean, 10 years ago, the Freedom of Information Act came into force. Tony Blair called it his biggest mistake. If I was going to be partisan, I would say that was a very hotly contested field. But it was a historic piece of legislation. It wasn't perfect. My aim, if I'm going to be honest with you, is to make freedom of information redundant. My view is that we should be proactively making public everything that is appropriate to be made public. So that you should make redundant the need for people to ask for access to information. We should be doing it proactively, because the state has to be the servant and not the master. Taxpayers deserve to know how their money is spent, and it shouldn't be like getting blood out of a stone to get information out of government. So our presumption now is that everything should be published as a matter of course, unless there's a compelling reason not to do so. So it's public spending government spending over 25,000, government contracts over £10,000, details of hospitality, salaries of senior civil servants, job descriptions, objectives of permanent secretaries, the progress assessments, the ratings of major projects from Crossrail to nuclear submarines, which produced, when we first proposed that we would publish on an annual basis the major project authorities' rankings, the ratings, the RAG ratings of these projects, there was a fair degree of horror. But actually, we've now done it twice, and it will now become impossible for future governments not to do this. And what it does is to build trust, because the not particularly surprising thing is that if people see that a government is volunteering information about things that aren't going well, without it being kind of dragged out gradually out of you, then it's just possible people might believe you about things you say are going well. And this is about the slow process of starting to rebuild trust. There's, of course, a balance. I am a transparency zealot, but actually I think the Freedom of Information Act probably doesn't protect some things that need to be protected vigorously enough. You know, we do need to protect diplomatic correspondence. Governments need to be able to communicate very candidly with each other in a way that is not, people aren't kind of always anxious, is that going to be disclosed? Secrets which genuinely endanger life and security, although that can sometimes be used. National security is always high up on the list of reasons why things can't be published. And also protecting that proper safe space that needs to exist, where civil servants give very candid, forthright advice to ministers about what it is they want to do and about the implications. That has to be an uninhibited space for that advice and for discussions between ministers. The data on which decisions are based and the evidence on which decisions are based absolutely should be published. And sometimes decisions will get made for which there is no evidence, and that's fine too. There are perfectly good reasons for doing that. Plenty of some of the things we've done, we didn't have evidence to support it to begin with. The evidence grows as you do it. But we should be open about saying that's the reason for doing it. So it is crucial, but we should get that balance right, be vigorously proactive about publishing data and evidence, and then vigorously protect the things which need to be protected. But it's a crucial tool for improving public services. It can cut costs. You start to get benchmarking comparisons between different parts of the state. You can see where savings are possible. It can help to drive up standards, and we're beginning to see this in the health service with unprecedented degrees of transparency, started by Bruce Keogh when he was still the doyen of the heart surgeons before he became medical director of the NHS, where the openness on transparency on outcome data from cardiac surgery has driven up performance, has driven down mortality rates markedly. It's very empowering. It gives people choice over the services. It allows them to make better informed decisions. Publishing local crime statistics helps residents to demand more and in a more focused way from local police forces. Publishing exam results helps parents to find a school that's right for their school. And again, at every stage, there have been objections raised that, well, of course, what we do is different. It can't possibly be compared. And there will often be justice in that. There will often be some substance behind it, but you explain. Publish, compare, explain is the way it should be done. But it can also, as I say, it can be a feedstock for business. Open data can connect together disparate parts of the state in order to enable proper holistic solutions to be provided. During the flooding at the start of this year, we brought together 200 software developers and computer programmers. We gave them access to data that had previously only been available at a cost to a small number of insurance companies, including we made available 15-minute readings from every river level sensor in the UK. Within 2 days, they came up with a range of solutions to help, from a phone service connecting people with their energy supplier in a power cut to an app that alerts Twitter users to local volunteering opportunities. Since those floods, there's been a strong demand for flood risk assessment data to be released to help local communities better protect themselves. When it comes to something like flooding, our national information infrastructure can be as important as its physical infrastructure. I'm pleased to announce today that the Environment Agency will be releasing this as open data. This release was originally planned for next April, but we brought it forward with the support of funding from the Cabinet Office. It accompanies the release of other open data from the Environment Agency, including real-time river levels, flood warnings, and flood alerts. And together this will enable businesses large and small to develop local flood warning systems or integrate the data into their systems. And let's be clear, this is data that's accumulated and maintained at the taxpayer's expense. And so it's right that this data should be made available for the public. But there's a wider point. The way people now use technology and discover information is changing. More people interact with news and information through social media compared with more conventional sources. And we need to find ways to integrate and adapt vitally important information for people in the most effective way. There's huge potential for technology mashups between flood data and, for example, Google Maps, making it more accessible and easier to use. So this is just the beginning. Data.gov.uk, our open data portal, now has 16,000 open data sets and information on a further 4,080 unpublished data sets. Everything from live traffic information to statistics on childhood obesity. And on this scale, open data can be a raw material for economic growth, just like iron and steel and coal were to the Industrial Revolution 200, 300 years ago. So we launched the Open Data Institute under the chairmanship, the leadership of Nigel and Sir Tim Berners-Lee to incubate new startup companies that can use this data for new products and services. One of these is a firm called Transport APL. It's founded in 2010, nurtured by the ODI, drawing together otherwise disparate central government data from the likes of Network Rail, Transport for London, and the Department for Transport to create a single source for all UK transport information. Nobody had previously done that in a consistent way, and they've done it in a user-friendly, low-cost way. 900 businesses and developers are now signed up to use their data. Some have used it to create new transport apps, so it's brought faster, more convenient travel information to the public, fewer delayed journeys. It's created several new businesses. And it's worked because some brilliant people outside government were able to spot an opportunity. So we're going to carry on pumping this data into the public domain, fueling more ideas and solutions, creating more businesses and jobs. But we won't stop there. Our national information infrastructure is focusing on improving the quality so that businesses can rely on the most critical data to be published on time using common identifiers and in the most accessible ways. We want all of the data user community to contribute via data.gov.uk. We've also set out our commitment to a right to data, helped establish the Open Data User Group. It's easy to be open about the things that don't really matter. What really counts is releasing the information that people and organizations most want to have. And that's what the Open Data User Group does, is funnel in the demand and enable us to drive, make decisions about priorities in a better informed way. The international scene. Earlier this week we hosted the first summit of the new D5, the group of the most advanced digital governments in the world. Each one of those founding members, Estonia, Israel, New Zealand, Korea, and ourselves, that's South Korea, I should stress, we all recognize that transparency and openness is a key plank of reform. It's clear that around the world, open data is starting to be seen as a fundamental part of government and stronger growth. We've, as I say, established ourselves as a world leader, and this week we were again ranked first in the Global Open Data Index. The ODI has today published its Open Data Roadmap, and we welcome the recommendations. We recognize we need to continue progress. We're setting the standard on open data, but others are moving fast here, and we need to continue. We're only at the beginning of this journey. We came together 3 years ago with 7 other governments, but crucially also with civil society organizations to launch the Open Government Partnership. And through our year when we were the lead chair of that organization, we were supporting allies on their path to membership, helping ensure that members deepened their commitment to transparency. I mean, the French government has been very generous in giving us credit for persuading them, showing them what the benefits of the Open Government Partnership would be, so they're now a member of the steering committee of the Open Government Partnership. The point I always make about this really important partnership between civil society and governments in the Open Government Partnership is that I see the Open Government Partnership, also the D5, these are support networks for reformers in government. People outside often see governments as a kind of homogeneous thing, but within every government, and this is true among politicians and among officials, there are reformers and there are resistors. Digital and openness, these are the friends of the reformer. People who want to change things, who want to drive out corruption, who want to drive improvement and cost efficiency and all of these things that we're going to need more and more of over the years and decades ahead. And it's very important that the civil society organizations continue to be very alert to who are the people within governments which are driving openness and who are the resistors. We're also keen to ensure all local authorities reap the benefit of open data. It matters at a local level, and that's happening. The Transparency Code sets out minimum data that local authorities should be publishing. That's not easy to coordinate, a multitude of different and overlapping local services and jurisdictions, but there are some great examples. And there's much happening on that front, and we are supporting that from the Cabinet Office, and we'll continue to work with the Local Government Association and ODI to support that. So openness is not a soft option. It takes us out of the comfort zone. It requires tough decisions, as I say, endlessly creative reasons why it shouldn't be done, national security, legal reasons, we're often told, commercial confidentiality. And the last resort is, well, Minister, the quality of the data isn't very good, to which my response is, publish it, and it'll pretty soon get better. And it does. The rewards are enormous. More accountable government, smarter, more responsive, more cost-effective public services, new jobs and business, and we're only at the start of this journey. We've taken some good steps, but we need to make sure, all of us collectively, that this is now an unstoppable and irreversible journey. Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. Just before we move on, I just had one quick thing I wanted to just check in that. I suppose looking at it from your point of view as being the minister in charge, what do you think was the most important thing you personally brought to it in the role of minister to this agenda? As in, couldn't come from anyone else, it had to come from that political side. And secondly, maybe you might not want to get onto this, but what was the most frustrating thing over the last 5 years from sitting there as minister that you really hope you can overcome in the next going forward?
The two things, the critical moment was the 12-month moment where, I mean, luckily we had a Prime Minister who got this, who did absolutely get it. And, you know, for anyone in government, there'll be times when you say, oh my God, why on earth are we committed to do this? But actually, by and large, we kind of kept our nerve and seen it through. But that critical moment after the first 12 months where he sent around his second letter around Whitehall saying, these are the next things we're going to do. That was the moment, okay, we're serious. We're going to see this. The biggest thing I've brought to it is being just very bloody minded, really. And difficult, but actually, the biggest thing I think I've done actually is to bring in people like Nigel and others, proper experts inside the tent to help us, because one of the things we've done with the Transparency Board is we bring different bits of government who then produce all their reasons why it can't be done, and colleagues who know much more about this and much more expert than I do, really helped to break down the opposition. It's been hugely important. It doesn't happen spontaneously.
And most frustrating?
The most frustrating? I mean, what are the battles we've lost? Not that many, actually. Things have been slower. The flood data, that didn't happen spontaneously. There were some conversations along the way on that. Mapping data, we know there's a massive prize with mapping data. We are making progress. We've made quite a lot of progress. We sometimes, because we kind of always glass half empty, you know, how do we keep filling it up? We sometimes lose sight of the part of the glass that is half full. So it's just, you know, I don't get any particular frustration. You just have to keep at it and be tenacious.
Excellent. Great, thank you, Francis. Nigel, I think you've been involved in, Francis already touched on some of your involvement in this, including at the ODI, but also on the Transparency Board. I think before that you were an advisor to the previous government, brought in by them to advise on open data. What's your experience been? How have you viewed this over the years moving forward? What do you think the key bits have been that have allowed us to progress this agenda and indeed what we need going forward?
Yeah, all right, okay. Well, just some reflections really on that process. Some of it is, as in a lot of life, serendipity. I recall in 2005, actually John Sheridan, who's here from the Office of Public Sector Information as it was then, approaching me, obscure part of government, actually mainly to dealing with the implementation of the European Directive on Public Sector Information, a European directive. How could that be a revolutionary instrument? You know, in fact, how could government be a revolutionary instrument, you might think? But I think we've seen in these areas, actually quite interesting why it can. John came and was actually talking about the idea of how could we up the capability to take diverse data from across the public sector and integrate it. And I was leading a research team then looking at new web standards and methods to do that. We did some work with ONS, the usual suspects, health, NHS, Ordnance Survey, whole range. And we just started to see the richness of this data, hopelessly siloed, most of it under restrictive licenses. But you could begin to imagine what the art of the possible was. In 2007, there was a Ministry of Justice report, went before Parliament outlining the opportunities. And there it would have stayed, you might have thought. But of course, famously, you know, Tim has a lunch with the then Prime Minister, with Gordon Brown, who's asking what he could do to take advantage of the web. And Tim just said, as he often does, the most disarmingly simple and profound statement, put your data on it. Yeah. And actually, and to his credit, that was exactly what he committed to doing. And of course that was in the context of a bunch of work from the Power of Information Review, other people, Tom's work, Tom Steinberg's work, Tom Loosemore's work, a whole bunch of people who were advocating that the modern state needed to make information work for it, not be dominated and enslaved by it in some sense. So that was the exciting bit. And so in 2009, Tim and I were set up as information advisors, and we had 6 months to deliver data.gov.uk. And we did it, I guess, because the great thing is we didn't know what we couldn't do. There's a great thing about coming in from outside of government when you simply don't know what the boundary conditions are. And we just imagined we'd do it like with any other project with our best students. We'd use open source software, we'd launch it as a beta, that is perpetual development. It's a thing that isn't perfect, it will be improved. And we had a whole range of activists from the outside who were informing and commenting on all this. So that was a really interesting experience. And so in January 2010, we released this, data.gov.uk, with a few hundreds and a few thousand data sets. But there were some serious obstacles. We were told not to go anywhere near geographic data. There were lots of bodies littering the landscape there, but we felt that without this connective tissue, you couldn't get anywhere, that everything happens somewhere. And I'll talk probably just to give a couple of more minutes on this in a moment. The other thing that happened was late in January 2010, I was on a platform actually with Francis, who was the shadow minister then, and he gave me to believe that the government, that the opposition had a view that this was really important. And it was that realization that this would play across political boundaries, that this is not a partisan issue. And there's no greater testament to that than the fact that one of the very few pieces of act passed by Congress in the US in the last number of years was the Data Act, which the Tea Party even supported along with the Democrats. Everybody likes to put data to work for their own purposes, and it can be very powerful. So, and that kind of, the technology manifesto that was produced by the opposition, where open data was everywhere, and coming to power, they and the coalition government, they kept their word. They set up the transparency team. The prime ministerial letters were informed by the strategy. They brought people in, and And then they started to do the really difficult stuff, which is release data that matters. And this was, the reported crime data, the various forms of health data, the data on local government spending, which we were told was impossible to release. 360 local authorities, but every transaction over £500 not just meant that there were new ways of scrutinising local government spend. Businesses have been built who sell procurement services back to local authorities who release the data to tell them how to buy smarter. So there's a whole a cascade of effects. I think, though, that we can look and see huge progress, but we also have to understand that there have been areas where it hasn't gone our way. I mean, the biggest missed opportunity for me was the post office address file. I will pass over that more in sorrow than in anger. But actually, it's a critical part of our national infrastructure, addressing. It's not that just everything happens somewhere, it happens somewhere rather precisely. And actually, to know more or less it happens within a mile or so or 2 miles so somewhere is just not good enough. So we need to really develop this notion of a national information infrastructure. And I will say a few words on that. I think that in our roadmap today, in the Open Data Roadmap, we talk about this. There is a danger that you think of an infrastructure as you've got some data sets and you'll think about them a little bit and you'll publish them. You don't publish stuff that happens to be lying around. You have to design an infrastructure. This is not a piece of happen chance. And to design a digital nervous system, an information nervous system for the 21st century, will include investing in capturing and designing data we haven't quite thought of yet. And some of it we're only just starting to see emerge. So this is a work in progress. It's fundamentally important, and it's critical that we spend some serious time not just assembling, but designing, thinking about what the characteristics for this will be in the future. And I think that will drive an awful lot of what we will see. And the other thing I would touch on is data literacy within the civil service. And we've been extremely lucky to have had advocates at the top and also middle out civil servants whose passion this is. But this is not representative. We simply don't have enough skills. This isn't high-end data science or data analytics. This is just an awareness of what it means to produce a data asset catalogue, or what we mean by machine-readable data, or what we mean by interoperable open data standards. And this is an awareness that we simply have to more widely promulgate. And I think, give me 1,000 civil servants and we could train them fast and quickly and efficiently. That's what the ODI does. Give us an opportunity to put just a few red teams, a few groups of people into the various departments of state, and we would make the quality of what's published even better than it is. And I think that working together, working with folk at the GDS, we could do something really powerful to begin to put data at the heart of our enterprise. A modern state needs to have this at its heart, not as assembly, as exhaust data, which is collected for the public by the public purse, some of it for good reason, some of it for mysterious, but let's design it. And a final point, we talk about open data. One of the areas of literacy that worries me is people's confusion around the various types of data. Open data, closed data, personal data, open data, aggregate data, anonymous data. These different strains have different requirements and different opportunities, and it's crucial that we don't get them confused. It's crucial that we put in protections where we need to, particularly around personal data. And if there's one thing I'd like to be doing, in a decade or so's time, looking forward, it's to be sitting here celebrating the same success around personal data, or my data, as we have around open data. The fact that real empowerment for consumer and citizens will come from control over the data that is about them, where that's appropriate, whether it's health data or educational data or whatever, or consumer data, utility data. This is an idea whose time is coming, and I think we have to be alert to that.
Thank you, Nigel. Jeni, just moving on. You've been involved in this from technical side, currently technical director at the ODI, but also I think working with government and with different parts as you've gone forward. And also I think most recently I was struck, Nigel, you were saying you were chatting with Francis when he was part of the opposition. I think you've been involved in the advisory group to the independent review that's worked its way through to Labour's new proposition. So I'm just wondering your personal reflections, but also quite interested in whether you think, I mean, Nigel was saying this is potentially not a party political area. How much do you think that's true? How much do you think we've got the space to move forward on that basis?
Okay. So I was going to start with going back to how I first started in the whole open data space, which was with my work on legislation.gov.uk, which was the work of very many people, and most notably John Sheridan, who has already been mentioned and is sitting in the audience right here. Now, that was, we started developing that in kind of 2008, 2009. It was launched in 2010, and it was a really revolutionary platform in many ways, not least because it was developed in an agile, iterative development fashion, that it had user needs at its heart of its development, but also because it was driven by data and driven by openness. And I wanted to pick out three particular things that I feel were really important out of legislation.gov.uk, which need to be replicated throughout the publication of data within the UK. Those are that data was at its heart, that it thought about data user needs but didn't let itself be hung up before pressing on, and also that it was part of a coherent strategy that went beyond transparency and to providing the kind of national information infrastructure that Nigel was just talking about. So the first point then, that data was at the heart of legislation.gov.uk, was that we actually designed the API for legislation.gov.uk, the way that machines would access that information, before we started to design the user interface for it. So it was driven from the data that was available. It was driven from making that data reusable and available for everyone. And that meant that there was no extract process that you might forget to do. It wasn't a matter of somebody manually having to create spreadsheets that then got posted onto some website and sometimes got forgotten about. It meant that it was an embedded part of the process of making that information available, was making data available. The second was around data user needs. Now, we are now in a situation where we have wonderful groups like the Open Data User Group who exist to provide feedback into government about the data that would be useful for people outside government. But I have to say that at that point, then there weren't any existing users of legislation data, because it wasn't something that was being sold. Not like Ordnance Survey data, for example, or Environment Agency data, which can be sold, and therefore you know what the data user needs are. It was really a matter of faith that there would be user needs, there would be data users that would want to use this data. And that, in fact, we were the best example of that. The website for legislation.gov.uk was the best example of taking the data and doing something with it, providing it and presenting it. So we were the data users that we were trying to address. And we have this problem now, and it's an ongoing problem, that developers like me and data scientists who love to play with data can only get hold of the data that they can get hold of in order to answer questions that they want to answer. And so that means that we tend to focus on where the data is rather than what the important questions are. And that's an issue. It's a bootstrapping issue. You can't prove the need for data unless people are asking for it, but people don't ask for it because they focus on the places where the data is already. And you need to get out of that bootstrapping process by having a bit of a leap of faith and publishing data even when you don't have provable, right now, user needs for it, I believe. The third thing that I wanted to pull out was that with legislation.gov.uk was that it was part of a coherent, that its publication was part of a coherent strategy. So we have a problem in this country that people keep passing laws. Legislation keeps changing. And that means that Legislation Gov UK kept on falling behind and behind and behind in its data quality because it couldn't keep up to date with the latest changes that were going on. And you have to recognise that the small team in government is not able to keep up with these constant amendments to legislation, to keep our legislation up to date, our public legislation up to date. So the open data aspect of legislation.gov.uk was part of an essential strategy to enable government to provide up-to-date legislation for everyone. And it did that by motivating people outside government, including academics, including people outside the small team that is built for updating that legislation, motivating them to contribute because they knew that their contributions would also be open for them to reuse as they would like to. And so that openness meant that the work that they put in was work for everyone. And I see this as a really important step in understanding the true transformational power of open data. It's not just transformation on the outside, out of government. It's transformation on the inside, within government, to become more efficient in the way that we can provide services within government. And so as an example, I hope John doesn't mind me quoting this, but they had an update sprint last week where they were trying to update a bunch of legislation, and really with a focused effort, and within that week I managed to put into place 2,000 new effects, which is equivalent within that week of what they had as their best yearly number of effects that they could put in place previously. So it really shows how process improvement can be driven through open data. So those three lessons for me really demonstrate that you only get the true transformative power of open data when you embed it into the publication, when you embed it into your processes. And in fact, that's the only way that you get any kind of transformation outside as well, because it's only when there is a consistent, reliable, sustainable, good quality supply of open data that those outside government can actually rely on it. And we're beginning, we see this now. Legislation Gov UK was obviously the one that I worked on, the one that I feel really passionate about. But there are other cases now where there's data that is being published as part of the essential process. Crime data was mentioned. ONS data has been published as part of its essential process for a long time now. Flood data, as has been mentioned earlier on, are ones where it can be published as part of its essential process. And going back to your question, Julian, about the Labour Digital Government Review and the recommendations within that, what we talked about there was recognising the fantastic steps that have been made around transparency and accountability in the publication of data, particularly by this government, but also to try to see how that could be embedded into the services that the public sector is providing. And so that performance data would also be published. How long it takes you to get hold of your new passport, for example, or how long you're going to have to wait in the hospital waiting list. That those pieces of performance information is just as important as the spend data that is currently being made available. But for that to happen, then it has to be built into part of the digital strategy for providing those services.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thanks, Jane. Tom, I alluded earlier to your sort of select committee appearances a little while ago. I first became aware of this agenda when I was working at Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, and suddenly a few, not yourself, a few slightly odd people started turning up, sitting in a corner, running a little project. And it sort of seemed to grow from there. Very enthusiastic people, obviously not necessarily coming from the traditional way I'd have formed a team inside the strategy unit. It strikes me that there's been this huge community outside of government, which has been pushing, driving, reinforcing itself, and then sometimes moving into government and engaging with politics, with the civil service. And you, of course, have moved across that bound. So I was just wondering, yeah, I'm sure just picking up your reflections and the time you've been involved, but also I was really interested in that movement, how much you think the movement is occurring between those different worlds, and how important is that going forward that we make sure that that continues?
Very important that movement continues. When can you start, Jen? Is a conversation we have pretty much weekly, to be honest. I'd like more people coming in than going, please. But I'll spend a bit of time looking right back, actually, beyond even that time. And then a little bit of reflection on the task force itself and the recommendations, which I hadn't read for quite a time. It was very interesting last night reading them again. And then a little bit looking forward, and some reflections on that. So my son will hopefully be going to university next year, but shortly after he was born, I co-founded a startup called upmystreet.com, which was a very simple idea. Type in your postcode and you get in front of you on a website local house prices, local school performance, crime data, ambulance data, etc., etc. It was a very simple idea. We were very lucky to stumble across it first. And we had acquired, it was all public data. But about 2 weeks after it went live and it started to get a bit of buzz out there, I got the phone call that I knew was inevitable from the lawyer at HMSO, as was then. I owe that lawyer an apology. I'll come back to that later. And the lawyer inevitably said, look, all these bits of public data have their own licensing terms, and none of them give you the right to publish them on the internet. To which we went, thank you very much, we'll see you in the press. Safe in the knowledge that if you go back to first principles, the fact that the taxpayer had funded the creation of that data, the fact that that data was published in order to improve the performance of public services, we were not going to be prosecuted ever by HMSO. The apology I want to give to that lawyer is there's a couple of books written which sort of allude to that, exactly that conversation, and make it sound like the HMSO and that particular lawyer was sort of very draconian. That lawyer was brilliant. She was absolutely brilliant because she said all the things I've said, but the way she said them to me, the tone of voice, made it abundantly clear to me that she knew that the game was up. And that she had gone on that journey of going back to first principles. The internet changes pretty much everything. Our existing licensing terms are going to have to change. Steady as you go, mate, you'll be fine. That's a very British thing, a very wonderful thing. And I'll come back to the importance of going back to first principles around this stuff again and again. Same thing happened with Parliament, actually, a few years later with They Work For You. Parliament, exactly the same with Hansard data and licensing of that. A couple of reflections on the task force, set up 2009 by Tom Loosemore, who was then a minister in the Cabinet Office, had a bunch of people on it, 7 or 8 people who'd been sort of fellow travellers on this journey from all over the place. It was actually chaired by Lord Allen, who's now a Lib Dem peer. So it was set up by a Labour minister, chaired by a Lib Dem peer, and now the agenda is continued by a coalition, which the Conservatives are the largest party. That's quite interesting. And when I think back to the conversations the task force had, they were really, the strategy was abundantly clear. The idea that this was a change whose time has come, that if you go back to first principles, the internet's now here, this is going to happen, finding evidence for that, even in 2009, was pretty easy. Pretty much the whole conversation of the task force was, how do we change the civil service, actually? And as with most things, that's where the power is, sadly, in some cases, if you're a minister. And if you read the 18 recommendations again, they're all about how do you chivvy along, twist the arm off, persuade the civil service to change its behaviour to adapt to this new reality, this new organising principle of open data. And if you go back to the 18 recommendations, that's about 15 too many, with hindsight, with the benefit of hindsight, they fall into sort of 3 buckets, really. There's a bunch of them that, I think if you're hearing the minister's speech, they're just the new normal. They've happened. We've sort of forgotten what a major change they represent. Not least how much data is now published, but also things like the license, the Open Government license, which I suspect John Sheridan, who I'm going to mention again, who not talked to John Sheridan, who's over here, was absolutely key behind. We've got a license that really works for them all. That's a big deal. And we just take it as normal now. There's a bunch of things around that are just, notwithstanding the improvements that can be made, we've come a long way. There's another bucket, again, which has been alluded to a lot, where some significant tensions remain. We've already touched on some of the issues around trading funds. The issue there is not open data, it is the notion of a trading fund. There's some other tensions remaining as well that were in the recommendations around the freedom and imperative for frontline workers to now to be able to offer advice online to people who are asking questions online. If people are struggling to know whether they should or could apply for a benefit for carers allowance or whatever, surely our frontline workers should be able to go into those online forums and help them there and then. That is not happening very much still. And the reasons for that I now understand, having spent the last 4 years inside government, they are deep cultural reasons why that is not happening. And the third area, I think, on reflection, the third bucket, was most surprising reading it, if I'm honest, was just how timid some of the recommendations now feel. Some of them around how government uses data around some of its core public services, how it uses the web, how it really responds to people's needs and understands people's needs and how it delivers services digitally and online. The recommendations are pretty pathetic, really. And it really took Martha Lane Fox a year or so later to sort of drive the revolution there. So there's two thoughts there, really. There's one is going back to first principles, the importance, and the second struck me was where today are we being too timid still? And it brings me to my final section, which I'm really glad Nigel's already mentioned, because, Sir Nigel has already mentioned, which is where next? And if we're going to be cognizant of first principles and the risks of timidity, where next, I think, is an honest assessment that the data that government uses to run its services within its departmental silos is not fit for purpose in a digital age. Notwithstanding, we publish a lot of it. We have digitized an analog state, silo by silo. And what you see on the likes of data.gov in terms of open data are the exhaust fumes of that digitization of analog government, paper-based government, fundamentally. And the issues you see with that around, which are touched upon here, are actually even greater when it comes to personal data. And that we have digitized a bunch of analog silos with people's personal data within it, such that the data is only fit for purpose within that departmental or even sub-departmental silo. We absolutely need a natively digital state. That's going to mean a different shape to some bits of government from my personal perspective. You have to have a situation, if you're going to reinvent government to be natively digital, where you don't share and copy people's data between departments, be that on disks, through the post or otherwise, preferably otherwise. But data about people and their activities with government, A, exists only once, so it's not shared, it exists only once. That's what happens in Estonia. And B, is accessed by government when the public permits it, a permissions model. I could go on around open data catalogues and some of the data infrastructure points around geography and. But that, for me, is where the narrative goes next, is where if you're not timid, if you go back to first principles, we need to design really boldly, and not be scared of it, a natively digital, data-driven state. That will have some institutional consequences. That will require, I suspect, some new institutions of constraint, because one of the reasons in our malleable democracy, we get away with how much data we store about individuals is our data's rubbish and we're a bit rubbish as government. If we got good at it, if we were as good at data as Google is good at government, I suspect that the trade-off with individuals and democracy would need to change as well. So that's where my head is, and you did say push the boat out, so I have.
Great, thanks, Tom. Yes, I'm glad to see some consistency between government digital service, because of course Mike Bracken was on this stage setting out his vision for a changed view of government a few weeks ago, and in fact, actually, I think we had John Cruddas sort of echoing a lot of that a few weeks later. So certainly almost becoming, repeating itself from here. Just before I open up generally, I was just wondering, a few people in the audience, John Sheridan has been mentioned a few times. I just wondered if you had any recollections yourself from the experience that you might want to share. Feel free to say no to that.
So I'm just coming up for 10 years as a civil servant, and almost all of that time I've been working in or around open data. But I was very lucky because Before being a civil servant, I was the head of technology at a small company that made e-learning resources, and I was desperate to lay my hands on some government data. So for the 2 years before I joined the civil service, I was engaging with a public organisation who had a data set that I so badly wanted to use. And I wanted to use it for all sorts of reasons. I spent a lot of time talking to them about how what I was trying to do would help what they were trying to do, if only they could provide me with the means of access. And it stayed with me, that thought of what it means to be someone on the outside who wants to lay your hands and do something good with something, and also some of the frustration. So that experience has stood me in very good stead. I think I'm as culpable as anyone for helping to digitise an analogue state, and I think this question of how we architect the national information infrastructure that we need in a digitised model, intellectually, that's the stuff that really interests me now. I obviously have a very particular interest in how you do that with legislation data, but it's which I could bore you about for a month. So someone should take the microphone away now. But I think these are the right questions.
That's excellent. Thanks, John. Paul, you're now Paul Maltby from Cabinet Office. You're now the actual official government insider leading open data policy. So I was just wondering, some reflections from you. There's been a little bit here about civil service is brilliant, but also it's the thing we most need to change. And the sort of, how does that play out, and how do you think the policy and the world will go forward?
I do think, I mean, this is a sense of where do we go, and this is one of the reasons why the roadmap is such a useful entry into this point in the debate, because there are data sets left to get. Some of those incredibly important core reference geographical data sets, but actually I think the terms of the debate is starting to shift, and I think if I'm going to pick out three things that have been sort of mentioned, but I think are really critical to where it goes next, is one is around making sure that the quality and the interoperability of the data, particularly the most used data, this national, we're talking about this national information infrastructure, to make sure that that is top quality, and that not just it can be used with all the technical data standards underpinning it, but that we've got a service standard to those who are using our data, so that they can open up businesses or use that with a degree of comfort that the data set isn't going to disappear or change utterly the next time they seek to access it. I do think that's important. I think the second bit of where this is changing is we're still working on a human level model here. You know, I've got open data ninjas within my team who are going out, working alongside increasingly bits of Whitehall, but also sometimes having mini battles around the place, trying to extract that data. But if you look at what's happening with the newly digital by default services that GDS and government departments are making, you look what's happening with the performance platform that's on GDS, what you've got there is the new digital services spitting data out. And I think there's an incredibly powerful use for that near real time, aggregated where it needs to be, data that is not gone and sought from a human to another human and then put into data.gov, but is actually just spat out of the system in an automated fashion. That's ultimately where this process needs to get to. We'll have to get there bit by bit. And the third thing comes back into the partly the civil service, partly those outside, which is it's using this data and using it internally. We've got a program we've started a few months back with GDS, with Mark Wolpert and Go Science, and with ONS, to try and use some of these data analytical techniques, data science within government itself. And I still think a big barrier is that when we go around to departments, they're not using it in the way that I see people outside using data. They don't have the technology that enables them to, they don't have the skills to enable that to happen. They're sometimes just not aware that world has changed so much. So doing a lot with both the analytical professions to bring that in, but I think that getting the system to value its data in the way that I see people valuing it outside is core to making that circle work, I think.
That's really great. Thanks, Paul. I was just wondering if Olivia's here from the RSS. I'm not sure. Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit, because another one of those groups that's outside, I mean, sometimes statisticians, in my experience, have a purity value on data, which can sometimes get in the way. But I think where the RSS has gone to with your latest pamphlet and your little, I wanted to have one, I've lost it on my desk because it's so small, which is very unfortunate, your new pamphlet, I was just wondering if you had anything to say about how you think that's going from the outside.
Yeah, so we've released a new data manifesto in September, which makes 10 recommendations for government. Several of those are around open data. A few of the ones that haven't really been touched on as yet are the private sector role. So when private sector is contracted, what should be done to ensure that data is shared from the private sector to the same standard as applies in government. And also we really support the clarity around definitions and the need to be clear about personal data because of the data trust deficit that we've identified in our research in the summer. And I think really we need to ensure also that in the furore around personal data that we don't put a brake on the public benefit research that goes on, and we really need to have a clear understanding of how the public should see how their data is used and at what stage public input needs to come in.
Excellent, thank you very much. Right, I won't come straight back to the panel after those, but I will come back to them in a little bit. But I just wanted to take some quick questions and comments from around the floor. And please do, I'm sure lots of people will want to come in, so try and keep anecdotes short and concise and questions to the point if you can. I'll start over here.
Dr. Leonard Anderson, Society of IT Management, very much local government. I'm embarking on a programme for collecting data of tens of thousands of older people living alone. It's continuous measurement of temperature and power uses in the kitchen. It's not actually personal data, but it's from personal locations. How should this sort of data and the huge quantities get into the ODI infrastructure?
That's great, thanks very much. Then I think David.
David Walker, Guardian Public. Picking up a point Nigel Shadbolt made, he was rather gentle about data literacy in the civil service. He might have extended the point to ask pertinent questions about data literacy on the part of the general public. And I have to say to Francis, his colleagues in the House of Commons, the RSS did some work not long ago asking MPs a basic question to test their understanding of probability. And given that a lot of data has a probabilistic form, the answer was less than 50% got it right. So, question, how far is a necessary correlate of the open data project attempts to improve the general quantitative understanding on the part of the British public at large and sections of the political class in particular?
Okay, thanks for that. And just right here at the front, thanks.
Thanks. My name's Matthew Trimming. I do some work with the NAO and also with some new suppliers who want to get into government from a technology perspective. Just wondering, picking up Olivia's point, what more from the existing contracts that government have with their major technology suppliers and the ones that will, well, the far greater number of ones that will come out of the disaggregation of the big prime contracting contracts over the next year, there seems to be an opportunity to look at some of the financial as well as the performance data and what pressures you can bring to bear on those.
Brilliant. Thank you for those questions. I'm just going to go back to the panel just now. If you want to pick up either on any of the particular questions or any comments that have been sparked by the other contributions, either from the floor or from the other panel members. Nigel, do you want to start?
Well, just on the point around data literacy, I think it's exactly right. This is actually a national requirement. I mean, a knowledge economy that is not data literate just doesn't make sense. And I think that we actually know quite a lot about human fallibility around probability. It's not just, actually statisticians are just as susceptible to mischaracterizing a Gaussian distribution. But it is an interesting question. What do we need to do and how would we put it center and at the center of what we do to train and educate? You know, there's a big push at the moment around programming literacy. I think it has to be the case that we think about this seriously from a data point of view, from a data analytics point of view. This doesn't have to be deep stuff. It needs to be, again, as I say, you can go a long way with a general appreciation of what the landscape is, what it is. We know this when we've tried to give some insight to demystify everything from programming sites to interact with the World Wide Web. You know, when you give a C-suite executive a sense that they too can write a 3-line program that does something, you know, this is hugely empowering. They get a sense of there's just not magic under the hood. So I'm absolutely with you on that. The point around, just one point around the issue around large amounts of, in a sense, personal data, but it has huge value in it. We have a network. We work with a number of, with the ICO, the ODI, and a number of other organisations around the UK Anonymisation Network, which is precisely about how can you safely release data that can be used, that relates to individuals. And I think we need to put a lot more effort into this. The thing is, there's no one technical silver bullet here. This is part about an enforcement issue, about being serious about what attempts to de-anonymise, if they should exist. It's serious about the best practice to ensure privacy where you can. But there's huge value in these data sets, and I think we must again, I think, work very strongly in this area. And the thing I can't resist saying is around public-private partnerships. We saw in the white paper, the Open Data White Paper, which had some really good ideas on it, there was a particular commitment around elder care provision, domiciliary care. This is the area which is very heavily now involved, private care provision, you know, elderly patients and such like. And there was commitment to a set of indicators there to be voluntarily produced, as well as private and public providers of this, around things like pressure sore data, you know, the rates of turnover of staff. That data in New York State is routinely generated, and you have a whole wealth of applications in the US that use precise data to evaluate and rank and determine quality of care provisions. And I think so in areas like that, there is so much still left to do, and it's actually about getting the private sector to engage. If it's going to provide this provisioning, they've got to get with the actual agenda as well. And there's no reason why they shouldn't, and actually I think it just needs a lot more work and diligence around that.
Francis, do you want to pick up anything? I mean, one thing I was really interested in were your views on the political side of this, because I think we've discussed how this is not really necessarily party political, but I think David was taking you down a route of just how political is it? Is it just a small group on the edge, or is this becoming something more mainstream, that mainstream politics can actually get some of the issues we've been talking about today?
Well, I think the point's a completely valid one, which is that not enough people know enough about it, which is not, as Nigel says, is not about no one needs to become experts on this, but it's partly the point Paul made about people around government not understanding what the possibilities are. I mean, who's sitting on vast amounts of data and not seeing, because it's not their fault. I mean, they're just nothing has prepared them to understand what the potential is that can be unlocked, or how you do it, and feeling it's all a bit intimidating. I mean, as we move, as I hope we will, more towards the default setting in policy making, that we routinely publish evidence and data, then I would hope that what would tend to happen in Parliament is that select committees would tend to be very interested in examining that data. And then I think it does go to the point that David Walker made, that actually you then get members of Parliament who need to have kind of basic understanding and need to be able to interrogate data and seek advice on it and be challenging on it, because that's, you know, that's what actually holding the government to account is kind of about. So I think that's there's room for a lot of improvement, but I think these things can kind of be a bit self-propelling. You provide more data, you use data more for what you're doing, and then those who scrutinise and interrogate then need to be more comfortable with using it in order to take it further. Point on privacy that Nigel made, which I think was raised by Leonard as well, I think is key. Privacy and security tend to be highish on the list of reasons why we can't do things. And it's easy to scare off ministers when civil servants say, well, minister, you don't want to be the minister who has to go to the House of Commons and announce this breach of data security, which has led to personal details being released. I mean, we've been really quite cautious in this, because I totally recognise that as you go down the path of open data and transparency, one bad breach can throw the whole thing back. So we kind of tread a tightrope in terms of cautious and not taking risks with anonymity being breached, but at the same time not using it as a kind of all-purpose, not allowing it to be an obstacle to making progress at all. And the technology does enable de-identification to be pretty reliable, and there is huge power in these data sets, particularly in the world of healthcare, and we need to be able to not be intimidated, not to be driven away from it by the fear of, which is largely unreal, of personal identity and personal data being opened.
Right, thank you. Jenny, do you want to...
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on a couple of the pieces around the private sector's publication of open data, and also what a government can do in order to encourage that. It's particularly driven by a piece of work that we did, which was funded from the Release of Data Fund from Cabinet Office, which is administered by the Open Data User Group, around how to embed open data into procurement. And it also ties in with some work that we're doing with IFG around procurement clauses and openness. And there are two pieces to this, and procurement is really a massively powerful lever for government to get data open, and one that it should be taking advantage of. The two aspects are the openness of the contracting process itself, and the openness of the contract, the payments, the KPIs and performance of the contract, of the service, which should all be made open and available. But the other is within the contract to make sure that any data that is produced as part of delivering the service is also made open and available. And the Crown having control over that data and being able to then determine how it is made available really should unlock a huge amount of information. Because when you think about it, then anybody who is providing a public service, whether they're a private company or whether they're public sector, they have to use data to do their jobs. And that data is incredibly powerful and useful for other people as well. If it's the locations of public toilets because you need to clean them, then that's data that could be made available just because you're listing it, because you are using it. And because you're using it, then it's likely to be sustainable, up to date, and so on. So ensuring that that publication of open data is embedded into contracts is actually a massive lever, and one that will take a long time to actually see fruition, because contracts go for a long time, but one that I think is ultimately incredibly powerful.
Great, thanks, Jane. Tom, just do you have any brief thoughts before I take in some more questions?
Just quickly on the gentleman here talking about replacing IT contracts, and also on the data, David's statistics question. Replacing IT contracts, we mustn't replace them with other IT contracts. Okay, they weren't an IT problem in the first place. Right? They were a service needing to be designed and run, and we made the mistake of thinking they were about technology. So when those contracts come to an end, we will all be about designing and building the capability with the private sector to continually iterate and commission services. And when you build a service in the 21st century, as is written into our service standard, an output of that has to be high quality performance data, and it has to sit on top of shared platforms as well. So it's a very big change, which we don't underestimate the challenge of which contracts are a part. Just quickly on the statistics point and literacy, I do buy the point of importance of education of the public around statistics and politicians. The place where I see the most need for education is within the civil service and also with ministers, is around the importance of data models and understanding the implications of how you shape and store bits of data in this world. It is the equivalent of choosing the width of our railway lines, the gauge of our railway lines, or which side of the road we drive on. These are fundamental, they're more important than that, even fundamental design decisions that could last us hundreds of years. I would, having spent a bit of time with ministers explaining this, they can get it, but we've got a long way to go to make sure we make informed design decisions that will last us many decades to come around the models of data we keep and what we relate to what.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Tom. Just want the lady there to start off, and then.
Good evening. I'm Rosanna Tremoglie. I'm judge in Sicily, and I started Accademia Respublica. It is an organization that promotes the constitutional rights and the rule of law principles. I appreciated very much what you said today, and you know what is facing Italy right now. The Moses scandal in Venice, the Expo scandal in Milan, and now the Mafia Capitale, the operation called Mafia Capitale. It's a big corruption involving the public administration at any level in Rome. And now, since I read you export UK open data best practices to the world, I would like to know if what you can do about that, because I think that the best battle against corruption is made by open data and transparency. So I hope you have something to export for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Then the lady at the back, then coming back to the front, and then in the middle.
Yes, I'm Sally Tabor, and I'm from the private sector. So I just wanted to raise some of the issues that we've been criticised. I think first of all you need to ensure there's interoperability between the NHS. Well, I work for the health sector, so between the NHS and the private sector. We've now got the Private Healthcare Information Network, and it's taken us quite a long time to get Section 251 permission to cross data, across barriers, access to the HES data. I've taken 7 years and we still haven't got access to the National Reporting and Learning System. So adverse incidents can only be reported from the NHS into the public domain. We don't have access to holding smart cards. The Minister, Ben Bradshaw, gave permission for that 4 years ago. We're still on the pilot. So just, I think, we take the criticism, but for goodness sake, look at the issues around it, the interoperability, and where we're trying to ensure that data is in the public domain.
Thank you. Then here at the front.
Thank you. John Young. The pace of change is absolutely extraordinary. Now, I respect and welcome the optimism of the panel, but what slightly worries me is there have been a number of problems in the past. I mean, to be specific, the amount of taxpayers' money which has had to be written off because those systems haven't worked. So my question, or my challenge to the panelists, please, can you try and stop me worrying? I'm a teacher of politics. I'm not a technical expert. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, gentleman there. And can I just check if there are many more people who want to come in? There, okay. Go ahead.
Yes, Hartley Miller. I'm both a management consultant and an academic to some extent. I have the experience many years ago of trying to advise on the commercialization of the statute law database, which is a predecessor of Legislation Co UK, and of Prince 2, which was created as a marvelous tool. And I also have the experience of being chairman of a small company which integrates the laws in order to produce welfare benefits advice. And what worries me from what I've heard just now is there seems to be a perception that as soon as data is freely available, as it were lying on the street, that somehow the public interest has been sufficiently served. But actually, there's another part of it. It's a bit like research and exploitation. Someone's got to actually make that bridge, and we seem to be relying on the private sector. There are difficulties. And I don't think that simply having a good strategy, as Tom says, of integrating everything is actually going to produce products at the end of it which cover the whole spectrum of what the public should really be confronted with.
Helen Gardner. I understand that the land registry is no longer going to be sold off, but I'd like to know when it will be fully searchable rather than just by address.
Thank you. And then the gentleman just across there.
Tim Bradley. Very interesting presentation. Do you think that we need, in a sense, new forms of journalism and activism that sort of are local and expert, for example, that would use such data to spot things like the Stafford problems, the Rotherham issues?
Okay, great. Thank you for those questions. I'll come back to the panel. I'll sort of work from Tom across, but come back to Francis at the end. Just specific answers from very specific questions there, so we can try and pick up one or two of those, but also just any general thoughts that you want to bring out before we close. Tom?
Very quickly, land registry. It's a very interesting example of where you have an unhelpful mix of personal and open data in an analog form that's not even really been digitized properly. So it's a really good example of where the thinking needs to happen, is happening actually. I'm currently based in Croydon. To work out how we do that, that is non-trivial to do, and the consequences are pretty profound actually. So not quickly is the answer, because we can't release personal data when it's merged with open, because that's releasing personal. But the thinking is definitely happening. How do you do systems of record that are tamper-proof digitally? All that thinking happening. Quickly on the point around data journalism, everywhere I look as a former journalist, I see young journalists playing with data. I see courses being set up. One set up in the LSE this week. Really exciting space if you're a journalist, as long as you can find something to fund the journalism. If I was a journalist, a young journalist again, I'd be all over this to make my career. And that's probably enough from me. I've said far too much.
That's very Jeni.
Okay, yeah, I'll simply be brief. I think on the point around that it isn't enough just to open up data and then expect suddenly things to happen. I think that's absolutely true. Making data available is a necessary but not sufficient drive towards there being extra tools and services that are built on top of them. So, for example, at the Open Data Institute, then we actively incubate organisations and young companies who are trying to make their way in the world, and help them to work out what their business models are and help them and mentor them. And that's one way of helping to support the next generation of products and services to be built around open data. Another thing that we do is the Open Data Challenge series along with Nesta, which is actually framing the challenges, which are the real questions, the real things that need answering, the real services that need creating, whether they're advising children about where they take their next steps in education, or whether they're about working out how you can do house swaps so that you get better usage of public housing. Being able to, it's not sufficient to just open up data and expect things to happen from it. We need to have extra kinds of support there for companies to grow and build services and products around them.
Thank you. Nigel?
A couple of points. On the point about IT projects and the taxpayer purse, I mean, I think this is in the past we have just done such a terrible job on this, and it's usually because we have tried to procure against a moving set of requirements. We've had very large systems integrators whose interest isn't necessarily on to give you the best value for money. And the world has just changed in the way that software can be commissioned and developed. And I think a lot of that has had to do with the recognition that the most successful computing infrastructure on the planet, the web and the internet, are decentralized, open standard-based systems where people openly innovate and trying to imagine that some set of have all the best ideas. So I think the way that GDS has decomposed it into very, very ruthlessly user-centric services and capabilities is just the right way to go. The question is, what do the services that government needs for itself look like on this agenda? And I think that comes back to this whole idea of designing a digital state effectively. One other point, I would just sort of make the some of what we do is extraordinarily prosaic. the way that we will make real differences are by things that seem so appallingly mundane that why could they matter? The fact we now have company house data as open data where there is a stable identifier for a legal entity which is a trading company in the UK allows us to do a huge range of things. If other government departments would use that identifier to reconcile spending with contracts, for example. I mean, and so it's also about getting ourselves to use these kind of hugely valuable assets and to design them, design the identifiers that the state needs. And the civil service, you know, we wouldn't be where we are without really capable and able individuals who have pushed this agenda within government, with ministers of all stripes who have had the courage to take it forward. So let's respect that. But we have to invest in training a significant chunk of the civil service to a higher standard of capability in data. And it's a very difficult thing to persuade anybody to do, to invest in the civil service, to upskill. I think that is the only way we will get change fast enough to deliver at the speed we need to deliver.
Thank you. Sorry, Francis, the final words to you, but a couple of things maybe worth picking up. I think one, the interrelationship with the private sector, in particular, how that's going to work. And we of course have a very big interest in the transparency around some of that contracting. But also, I think the exporting question on what we have to export around the world, and you've been at the heart of that. Any thoughts and reflection on that, as long as anything else you wanted to cover?
Okay, well, on the private sector thing, I mean, we are more transparent already. We publish contracts. I mean, this is much more open than it has been. We are many more contracts have had open book accounting requirements in them than is generally understood. It's just that actually too few people in government know what that means, and so it's kind of tended to result in endless demands for more data from the supplier, which can end up with obscuring the truth rather than providing it, illuminating it. And we need to do this. I mean, we've got some work going on with the private sector to work out what are the few things that you need to have openness between the commissioner and the supplier, and get that right. The key thing with transparency is the outcome. Actually, it's what's the outcome. And I thought Nigel's example of, you know, the care providers in New York, which I suspect isn't statutory. It's kind of simply, and it'll become these things become competitive. So actually, you know, beginning of outcome transparency in the NHS was a bunch of a particular specialty of surgeons who just voluntarily, under Bruce Kaye's leadership, decided to do the really brave, tough thing to do. Really tough thing to do. But once you start doing it, you can't go back, and then it becomes necessary for everyone to take part. So I think that's partly on it. The gentleman has concerns about big IT contracts. Nigel's exactly right. We were doing this in an appallingly bad way. We outsourced too much. We lost too much capability in-house. One of the things we are now doing is building back in-house that capability, which is partly through bringing people back in from the suppliers, partly bringing people in from outside, partly skilling up mainstream career civil servants, which is being very successful, but it's a very different way of doing things. It's thinking about it completely differently. What was really interesting was at first, I guess Tuesday and yesterday we did the D5 summit. We were not all talking literally the same language, but we were using the same phrases. We were talking about all these governments. It's incredibly reassuring, actually, finding we were all talking about doing these things in the same way. As you say, disaggregating, shorter contracts, everything very iterative. And, you know, when the Obamacare thing went belly up rapidly after, doing a classic old style, you know, commission, procure from a big provider, big bang, release it, oh my God, it doesn't work. I mean, it must have been really annoying for the Obama administration, but a lot of the US media then said, why didn't they do it like the Brits are doing it? Which I can see was annoying, but flattering. And actually, interestingly, when we were in DC a few months ago, they were they've just set up a US digital service, which they explicitly say is modelled on GDS. Imitation, that's the most sincere form of flattery. So I think all of that's, it's not to say we're not going to have things go wrong, but the point is it's always a work in progress. It's just never a finished product. It's always being iterated, always evolving and being adapted around the user need, because actually you're measuring the way users use the service all the time, and so you're constantly improving it. The point about your point very graphically, is it enough just to leave the data lying around for people to use? Well, that's a kind of constant debate, actually, and one of the arguments against, we're always kind of zealously insisting what we want to be published is the raw data, unprocessed data, and that will not always be useful. But what you have to guard against is the holder of the data in the public sector holding it to itself and then adding value to it, what they think is value to it before it's really. And we need to make it available for others to do that themselves and make it. Our sort of default setting really is make the raw data available free as open data, but then not necessarily stop the entity, whatever it is, that might be the land registry or whatever, Companies House, whichever organisation it is, doing value-added processing, because there may well be outside organisations who want to pay for that, but what they can't do is hold it as a closed monopoly, because that's actually that's holding back the economy. As a whole, but it's always a kind of quite a lively debate, but we're always in favour of kind of maximum openness of core data. And just point on the land registry. My view is actually what happens with the ownership of any of these entities, whether you bring private capital into them or not, is a second order issue. But what is absolutely clear is that the data has to remain public property. That's absolutely clear. We haven't always got that one completely right.
Great, thank you, Francis, finishing on that note of, well, I think we all interpreted it ourselves.
I think you all know what I was referring to.
Exactly. Look, well, thank you very much. And I should say a big thank you to the ODI and the team there that helped us put together this event. But I hope you'd all join me in thanking our speakers and panelists for their great contributions.